Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Penguin Random House Book and Author Festival, hosted by Library Journal and School Library Journal. My name is Stephanie Close. I'm LJ's media editor, and I'll be moderating your final session of the day, Listen Up, Audiobooks Read by the Author. Due to scheduling constraints, this is a pre-recorded session, and it will be available in the virtual environment for 3 months. There is no live Q&A, but feel free to leave your comments on Twitter with the hashtag #PRHBookFest. I am delighted to be here today with Jasmine Mans, author of Black Girl Call Home, and Quiara Alegría Hudes, author of My Broken Language. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Yes. Jasmine, why don't you go first? Can you tell us, was this your first time recording your work? And was there anything about the experience that surprised you?
It was my first time recording my work, and I was surprised by how emotional it was. It kind of felt ceremonial in the sense that like all writing was done and edited, and now you have to read it, and you're in this space alone. And I was like looking at a director, and we were just intimately going through this narrative, and there were tears and so much emotion. And I didn't expect it now.
Quiara, how about you?
Yes, I come to the book world from playwriting. That's where I've made my home for the last 15 years. And it's really the opposite experience because as a playwright, I write words and I embody the spirit of the piece. And then at a certain point, it leaves my body and it belongs to the actors' bodies. And it's not mine anymore. This was totally the opposite, whereas in a ceremonial way, it really came through my body. I read some of the pieces aloud as I was writing, when that was a helpful thing to do for editing purposes and for energy purposes, but I had never read the whole thing straight through aloud like that. And so for opening night to be in the recording booth, like in my voice, in my tears, in my pulse, it was beautiful to embody it in that way.
And so we're celebrating National Poetry Month this month. And can you both talk a little bit about the experience of reading a poem versus hearing it spoken aloud?
I don't know if you have any thoughts, Quiara.
Or text in general. It doesn't even have to be just poetry.
I get this question a lot, and I think the mediums do things for one another, and you dwell in the mediums differently. And there's certain poems like in my book, I wanted to write a poem like as if it were a play, and I have no experience as a playwright, and for me it was style. I don't know the essence of playwriting, but it was truly form and imagination for me, and you can't express that stylization through aloud, like what I wanted people to see, and like the different things about like maybe the props or the different things that I wrote, or like I wrote a piece about Serena Williams, and I wanted the words to look as if they were jumping like a ball, and you wouldn't have gotten that experience if I was saying it. You get a different experience, right? But like in my head, I was like, this is a ball and it's jumping across and so those are the things that we're allowed to do with the page. And then when you're talking about like the stage and like the spoken aspect of it, you play around with voice and like rhyme and rhythm, and now it becomes like an experience within the body that is, it's also dynamic in its own way.
I just, from the youngest age I can remember, it was all about eavesdropping for me. I would, make myself kind of invisible somehow so I could get the goods. And the goods were my elder stories, my cousin's stories, and it was the text and the content, but it was also as you say, the style, like the human voice and different people's speech patterns have so much style. And I fell in love with it. And also because in my family, everyone came from Puerto Rico at a different age. And so no two people had the same accent. No two people had the same ratio of English to Spanish. Like everyone's language was distinct. It made it all the more musical and symphonic. So I think it was natural for me to start in playwriting because I just love the way people tell stories so much. And then to give it, I've written for every character but myself. It's the first time I wrote myself. And so to have to give that voice, it was wild. It was hard. And I realized, for one thing, how few words I can pronounce properly. Like I'm one of those book kids who knows way more words than I've said or heard out loud. So it was every few minutes, it'd be like, oh no, you got to go back and say this the right way. And ironically, there's a chapter in my book about my mom's accent and the words she mispronounced that I thought were improvements upon the correct pronunciation, like obnoxious, that's how she says the word obnoxious, which to me is an improvement upon the standard pronunciation. So that was a long-winded answer, but I think that just giving the text voice is so special. I love listening to audiobooks too, because especially women's audiobooks, because I love to hear a woman's voice tell her story.
What have you listened to lately that you've liked?
One of my favorite recent ones was Sotomayor's autobiography. I believe it's called My Beloved World. And Rita Moreno read it. And so it was really cool hearing these kind of badass, old school Latina kick-ass trailblazers, like one voice the other one's story. But Sotomayor did her, the preface at least. So she has a real husky voice. Her voice sounds like a tree trunk, and so it was good to get a little of that flavor in at the beginning.
Jasmine, do you listen to audiobooks?
You know what? I like just started like with my audiobook. I didn't know how big of a world it was. And I always like bought books, and I'm such a book hoarder. And I was like always one of those people where I'm like, I need to have the book on my chest, and I need to have it at all times. I need to be able to write on it. And then when I had my own experience, I was like, well, what else is out there? So I've like downloaded a few, and I'm trying to like get into the audiobook vibe. And so I've like downloaded like Dinesh Smith and Cicely Tyson's book, and some Toni Morrison things. And I'm gonna see what the vibe is now, because I'm super new to the audiobook world.
That's interesting, because I was going to ask if you were already a listener, if your experience of narration had changed your experience as a listener, but you're coming to it fresh. That's great.
Yeah, and I'm a fan of narration, and I'm a fan of narrators, and just great storytelling. But like I never truly dived into listen. And truth be told, like we listened to audiobooks in college, but it wasn't the same experience. But now I'm like, holy crap, this is sort of an art form, especially when the person reading it has a deep connection to it. And so I'm excited.
So Quiara, you write about your family in My Broken Language, which you touched on a little bit. Did that make it easier or more difficult to narrate the audiobook, do you think?
I had an emotional experience reading also, and I didn't expect to. That snuck up on me, and I'm not a crier. Like I kind of swallow the cry. So there was a lot of swallowing happening. And the parts that really got to me, one of the things I write about that's a consistent theme in the book is the role that silence played in my family and in the larger culture in the 80s and 90s as I was coming of age. You know, in many ways, we were not a silent family. My matriarchs, it was volume 11, like we lived loud. And so I think in some ways that exuberant volume that we lived at really put into relief the times when words didn't do it, when words couldn't cut it for us, and especially around AIDS and HIV and crack, like the suffering and the funeral count was high. And we didn't talk about that so much. And I don't think it was out of prudishness. I think actually, in some ways, the silence was one of the only ways we could control the narrative there. So when I get to those spots in the book and I'm reading and I'm saying Pico's name aloud, I'm saying Big Bic's name aloud, I'm saying Guijo's name aloud, and I'm putting voice into the silences that used to be unbearable, but that we kind of actually no longer need to survive anymore. Like they're old silences. We don't need them so much. Those were the parts when, it got me to be writing about my family and naming the things and saying it's okay to name them.
Can I just like say this? Like, I'm learning, like, it's about being able, I think like the emotional part is like when you hear yourself repeating it and you realize that that is the language, that what you said sounds exactly like how it was said in your home, how it was said by your mother, by that family member. And when you, and for so long, my journey was as a student of my craft, like trying to master something and be great. And I realized that like truly being a storyteller means to distill the story and remember it as it was once said. And I think the emotions for me hit when I realized like I did see these characters in my family who were in my book, and I weren't trying to make them different or make them more presentable for what I thought perfect or goodness was, and that they were perfect because they were as is, and I was and for the first time, that's something that I can honor.
It's beautiful. So Jasmine, I'm interested in your writing process. When you're composing your poems, where do you start? Do you start with the sound? Are you starting with the subject? You know, do you start with how it looks on the page? Is it different every time?
I think it's different a lot of the times. I really, truly do. There are some things that like are stumble upon pieces where like I was reading something or saw something and you got a thought and you wrote it down. And other things are way more mechanical where you're like, I want to write about how trees grow. And now I'm going to do research on that and take notes and build a web and make sure that I have a lot of different sources to build that thing. And then there are times where like you are writing from pure emotion and heartbreak or joy and excitement. And yeah, sometimes like I hear words and I'm thinking of sound, and then I'm writing based on the sound that I'm hearing. And so I'm having a verbal experience that then turns into written for the sake of remembering, right? Um, and it's different every time for me. Yeah.
Yeah. And Quiara, you touched a little bit on your background as a playwright, but would you like to expand on that? And you know, how did that experience affect your writing this project?
I was ready to, I knew I always wanted to write a book. It was this weird thing where it's like my pop would be like, so when are you writing your book? For the last 20 years. And I'd be like, I don't know. What are you talking about? I don't know. I kind of feigned innocence so he either planted that seed through those questions, or he could see and he was reflecting something that was in me. But I wanted to wait and I wanted to be ready. And so I spent 15 years working on the theater pieces. And I think one of the reasons I was drawn to theater is in part because I grew up a musician. So I had an affinity for the stage. I had an excitement and an enthusiasm for the stage and a comfort there. I also had an aunt who was a musician, and she wrote the music for the Big Apple Circus for 20 years. And so I would go turn her pages on the bandstand. I would watch as the different aerialists and acrobats rehearsed. And so these were familiar settings to me. I remember I saw so many clown acts, and I really knew which ones were the best and which ones didn't get as many laughs and stuff. And those things combined with probably my mother's spiritual world and her spirit practice, because my mother, growing up, my mother was basically like a spiritual genius, like a shaman. She is a santera of Jango in Lukumi, which is an Afro-Caribbean practice and philosophy and religion rooted in Yoruba in Nigeria. And it's a living room practice. And so I oftentimes got to watch and participate in her ceremonies too. And so there's just something about that live experience that leaves a lot of space for, I think, the sacred and the profane that I love. It felt like home. It still does feel like home. But then as my playwriting career, I worked off Broadway and I worked on Broadway. I worked around the world. As that kind of blossomed, there was some quieter work I wanted to do, some more interior work I wanted to do. And I really, looking back, me and a book, there were many quiet days in my childhood spent that way. And I would say those were life-saving days. Those built my world and saved my life. And so it was the next step.
And Jasmine, were you a bookish kid too?
Yeah, well, by way of poems, that I was always in love with poetry and was thrusted in poetry. And then I was also in love with everything from the civil rights era, and my family was as well. And so I found art by way of like so many brilliant Black narratives, and things like Martin Luther King and so many other people, and so many other movements became almost like art form to me. And then I began to like kind of understand like this entanglement of like our activism and our art form, and how art reflects life and the value around what stories we're telling.
And so, excuse me. One thing I always like to do when I'm moderating a panel is to ask the participants to share some authors or poets or creators that you think are underappreciated, that you'd really like to shine a light on. Is there anybody that comes to mind for either of you?
I don't know if these people are underappreciated, but I want everybody to know about Alicia Harris and Dinesh Smith. Those are poets who absolutely changed me. I feel like everyone knows about On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. However, I know it might not be an underrated piece, but I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces. And these are some like young authors that I think are teaching me so much.
I have to say, I think all authors are underappreciated, even the giants. I mean, I was watching Toni Morrison's documentary the other day, The Pieces I Am, and it was shocking to me, the kind of juxtaposition of the highest accomplishment and merit one can accrue on planet Earth, and still the underappreciation of a life's work. That really floored me. Yes, so many of my beloved authors, I think, are underappreciated. It wasn't until writing this memoir, I was like, well, let me do a deep dive into the Boricua memoir, the Latino memoir. And I made some discoveries and some rediscoveries. I had forgotten about Piri Tomas, who wrote Down These Mean Streets. I had read him as an adolescent, but I guess didn't connect in the same way, but that hit me hard reading him now. I think he's underappreciated. I'm like looking at my bookshelf right now. Ntozake Shange passed not too long ago, and I think she gets used to symbolize a moment and an aesthetic she's taught in that way rather than as an enabler of taking things to the entirely next level. I don't know. I feel like she kind of gets pigeonholed. Oftentimes she's like the Black woman on the syllabus or something, but I just think she's a giant. She's her whole own syllabus. Leslie Marmon Silko, Ceremony. It's one of my favorite books, and I rarely read anyone else who's met it. We could all go dig in each other's bookshelves and find things that we never even heard of.
I know, maybe it's a selfish question. I always like these answers. Could you both talk a little bit about what you hope readers will take from your work?
I think that's such a loaded question because I'm like, I feel so many things about the book, and I think that so many poems have different intentions, and in certain spaces in the book desire and asks of the audience different things. However, I want them to feel that someone knows their story. So there's a relativity there. I want to add my Black girl story to the canon. There is no one Black girl story, but I wanted to add like my story in there. And I hope that, that creates a space of oneness, of relativity, of more Black women taking up space in multiple facets, right? Like in storytelling and the emotional narrative, but also like in the literary industry. And so that's what I want people to take away, a presence of storytelling from a young Black girl who's also based in Newark.
I think I'll answer by sharing a piece of the book, which is probably my favorite thing I've ever written. It's the beginning of the last chapter, and I'm describing my abuela's house on American Street in Philadelphia. So these are urban Boricuas, most of which were born in Puerto Rico, but myself and my younger cousins born here. And there's a lot of different skin tones, we got chicken legs, we got righteous thighs. There's a lot of different body types, and a lot of different hair textures. And the reason I know this is also very matriarchal is we just walked around naked like all the time. Not like we would be hanging out on the sofa naked, but if we were taking a shower at Abuela's house or changing our clothes, like we saw each other's bodies a lot. And so the beginning of the last chapter of my book, I just describe our bodies, and they're not the kind of bodies you would see in Playboy magazine. They're not the kind of bodies you would see on network TV, but they're amazing bodies. And I just loved to see them. So when I looked at those bodies, it felt very freeing to me, and it also felt very natural to me. And I think that's how I want my reader to feel. I want my reader to feel free and natural.
Fantastic. And do either of you have a current project that you're working on that you'd like to share with the audience? Something they can be looking forward to in the future?
I have my musical In the Heights is going to be released as a major motion picture in June. So I'm thrilled about that. And I wrote the screenplay and produced on that. And so to have this book come out in the same year as that feels like a real blessing.
So exciting. Jasmine, is there anything you'd like to share?
I'm watching In the Heights when it comes out.
Me too.
I'm a new author, and I'm just like enjoying being like present in this moment. And so I'm just, I guess, honoring the time now.
This is a very wonderful thing about books, which is totally different than theater. Theater's much more stressful. At the time that the first audience is coming, you're still doing rewrites. It's like the public is receiving it while you're still working on it. It's extremely stressful, and you can never just be present in the moment of appreciation that's going out into the world. This is very nice. I'm done writing this book, and so I'm right there with you, Jasmine. I'm like, let me just experience this thing that happened, that I did, and be grateful for it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation, Jasmine and Quiara, and thank you everyone for joining us today. On behalf of Penguin Random House, Library Journal, and School Library Journal, we hope you've enjoyed this packed day celebrating books, authors, and National Library Week. Remember that the entire environment, including the booths and all of today's sessions, are available for 3 months. Come back if you missed anything, and tell your friends and colleagues they can still register. Thank you, everyone.